Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you from the Colonial Dungeon, this is the Court Martial Podcast! Introducing your host for this evening, he has a bald spot on the top of his head, and he weighs in tonight at a number you don't need to know. He is the Colonial Loudmouth, Sean McCarty! And welcome to another fantastic edition of the Court Martial Podcast. I am, as always, your Colonial Champion, Sean McCarty, and for the first time in over 5 weeks, here I am, standing alone, the last man standing, the only man standing, here for the greatest wrestling podcast ever to be created in the history of podcasting. You heard it here first. And as usual, we have a lot to talk about today, and thankfully, as of no fault of my own, we are going to try to keep this show under an hour, which we have not been able to do successfully for quite some time. And unfortunately, we have a lot of fun things to talk about, so we'll have to just see how the day progresses. And how, whether you're watching this at daytime or nighttime in the morning, maybe you just got out of the shower, maybe you're laying in your bed, maybe you're just sitting at home with nothing to do, thinking, man, I wish I had some emphatically powerful words to get me through the day in regards to the wrestling business. Well, I am here to oblige. And the first thing we're going to talk about is something that I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. We're going to do, I don't want to start a series on this, but it's not to say that we won't make this something of a series, but it's not official. I want to talk about those major kayfabe breakers. Not in order, necessarily, but those things, those major events that led to the cat being out of the bag. And what has led to where we are now, which is where wrestling is just a comedy show on both shows, and it's just an entire mockery of what the professional wrestling business should have been, ought to have been, and used to be, even as late as 2009, when there was still, in my view, a little level of legitimacy. But I guess that depends on where you go. But the first one of these ones we're going to talk about is the curtain call. Now, I can't imagine that anyone listening to this podcast would not know what the curtain call was, but I will break it down for you anyway. The curtain call was when Triple H, Shawn Michaels, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash all got in the ring at Madison Square Garden, hugged, even though 2 were heels and 2 were baby faces, posed together in the ring. There was a massive cheer from a very smart MSG crowd because the New York fans were always smart. And then they left the ring, and somebody had a camcorder with them before the age of cell phones. Somebody had a camcorder with them and recorded it. The tape leaked, and that was the major kayfabe breaker of the time. And this is, of course, after the steroid trial, and it wasn't even, well, I mean, after the steroid trial, but this was also after Vince McMahon had, in order to dodge some of the athletic commission fees from I forget which state, basically said, oh, we're not actual wrestling, we're entertainment. So obviously the cat was already out of the bag, but this was one from the boys. This was a big one from the boys that had that real shock value, but it really, if the fans didn't get it yet, they definitely did after that. And they were really teasing it a lot. I mean, they had the click cam that they did with Shawn and Diesel, and Diesel, Kevin Nash, and Scott Hall were leaving for WCW. And they wanted their little last hurrah. They knew the fans in Madison Square Garden were smart, so they knew they'd get a pop. But of course, the ripple effect of this was that a lot of the wrestling business was infuriated because that was something you just didn't do. It was an unspoken rule that even if the cat's out of the bag, under no circumstances do you ever break in that way. A lot of fingers were pointed after this thing, right? A lot were pointed at Shawn, and a lot of pointed were at Nash and Hall. I mean, obviously the 4 of them. But really, in my personal view, I think that the blame really has to go to Vince McMahon. Because unless Vince McMahon said yes, it wouldn't have happened. You know, and this was at a time when Vince McMahon, you know, not too differently from now, really had autonomous control over what was sent out and what gets back in after the curtain, what goes back through Gorilla, and afterwards, and this has been talked about so many times on all the WWE Network specials, that Vince was like, oh yeah, and it was at that moment I realized I done fucked up. And then he's like, well, who do I punish? I can't punish Nash, he's gone. I can't punish Hall, he's gone. I can't punish Shawn, he's the world champion. So that left Triple H, which is what left him. He was going to win the King of the Ring last year. He ended up jobbing all throughout the next year until he won it the year afterwards. But that, of course, in turn allowed Steve Austin to become Stone Cold Steve Austin. And Triple H instead was jobbing to the Ultimate Warrior and giving him a pedigree that Warrior no-sold. And, you know, here's my opinion on it, right? Because it's the old school fan in me, because I always make this distinction between the old school, the old school wrestling fan in me, and then the sports entertainment smark that I became as a result of just being born and grown in through the Ruthless Aggression era. That should never have been done. And obviously, Triple H went and apologized to everybody, and then afterwards, he cut that promo where he's like, I knew we were revolutionizing the business, we were changing things for the better. But really, the way I look at it is that there were a lot of guys who cared about the wrestling business and cared about what they could do for the wrestling business as opposed to what the wrestling business could do for them. And I think there was a very strong attitude difference there, especially with those guys in the Clique. And I like all of them. I mean, I have no problem with the work of any of those four guys. Not even Kevin Nash. I think Nash has really had his moments. I think that Nash kind of just got put in a position, the way that I view it, Nash got put in a position where he was always going to have a bit of a restriction on him just based on what he could do and what kind of promos he would give. But that's not to take anything away from the guy. But he was like a more polished Sid Vicious, would be the way I would put it. And really, when you think about it, they wanted what was best for themselves as opposed to what was best for the business, which is the ultimate irony in Triple H turning into the NXT mogul that he is and asking about what's best for business. Because really, at that time, Triple H was all about Triple H and the Clique. And that carried through during most of his actual active wrestling career. And of course, Shawn is a different person now, and Triple H is a different person now. And even Hall and Nash, you can make the argument, are different than they used to be. And the only one of the Clique that was not involved in that was Waltman. And I don't know whether it was that he wasn't there or that he wasn't invited, or maybe he just realized that it was a bad move. Because then now every single wrestler had to basically justify to the world that these people not only went into business for themselves, but now we got to act and we have to behave like we still mean this shit, like that we really still mean that we want to fight each other, when we've got the two top heels and the two top baby faces hugging each other. And here we are in 2020, and we're having company messages going, oh, we're all good friends and we all want to be friends and it's all just a happy, fun time. And now we're like so far into the hole with that where there's not even a chance that anyone could possibly take this seriously. And that's with some great talent on the radar when it comes to the Revival and MJF and Brian Cage. And I'm not just listing off AEW guys like Drew McIntyre, Bobby Lashley, which we'll talk about both of those guys a little bit later. There's a lot of guys who are really still trying to make it look and feel legitimate. And what happened with the curtain call is that it made it harder for everybody to defend that air of legitimacy. And were it up to me, and obviously it was not, which is why I'm here talking about it, but were it up to me, it would not have happened. But the blame of this goes on the booker, goes on the guy who let him do it. And this is just one of those things in a long laundry list of things that just baffles me, how Vince McMahon was able to let these guys politic their way so hard to where they basically were able to do anything they wanted. And it's not even it's not even the individual talent. They didn't even need the strength in numbers, but they used their numbers to pretty much run roughshod over everybody else in that company. And WWE's revisionist history will have you believe that these guys were such renovators and such big influencers and a huge part of why wrestling is the way it is today. But when you look at the numbers, you look at the pure numbers of when these people were on top, and I mean really on top, none of them, in the WWF at least, especially during those 94, 95, 96 days when they were really, all of them were all together in one place, WWE, save for right now, never did worse. And I think a big part of that is that when morale is down in the locker room, it makes the show look and feel worse. A big part of what made 2002 and 2003 so special is that, yes, it was difficult with the locker room because there were so many people in it, but everybody was working hard. They were getting big TV time. The reason that Austin and The Rock got big is that they were able to rally everybody as they were getting the holy hell beaten out of them by WCW, in part due to the fact that WWE had done everything they could to make sure that their ratings were in the toilet by the time that Hogan, Hall, and Nash had come and sparked some life into the place in regards to WCW. There really would be no justification for any of this. Responsibility goes on all of their shoulders. All of their shoulders. And it's one of the things, it's not the thing, but it's one of those things that very much when you look back on it and you think, man, what would have happened if this didn't happen? Would Steve Austin have still been Steve Austin? I wholly think he would have. I think that Stone Cold Steve Austin would still have been Stone Cold Steve Austin. It may have just taken a little bit longer to kind of rev the engines up. But there was no way that Austin was going to lose that in him, The King of the Ring 96, the fact that Austin got the spot instead definitely helped carry that along and ended up doing more good than bad. But really, the only reason that anything turned around in that company was because of Stone Cold Steve Austin. And later on with The Rock, I mean, Austin and Pillman, that was one of the big risque scenes, and they were never going to do that kind of stuff when the Clique was around, because the Clique was content. And say what you want about this, but the Clique was content with everybody else having an occupation, having a job, having the things, so nobody could possibly get anywhere in a semblance of better or improved or at the top of their game. When the top guys, which were, Triple H wasn't really at the time, when the really big guys were Hall and Nash and Shawn Michaels, and to a lesser extent, Goldust, to a lesser extent, Ahmed Johnson, and to some of these guys, and then Triple H, obviously, these guys, and Waltman. I can't leave Waltman out. These guys were, and Bigelow, and Bam Bam Bigelow, and Brett, obviously. You've got a lot of guys who are not the occupational people, but they had no problem making sure that all these people's gimmicks were dumb enough to where they could not care about anybody else on the card. And that was a big problem, because then the only people that looked halfway legitimate were the ones on top, and they happened to be the ones who were holding the most political power. So it's hard to say, because the Curtain Call's legacy is definitely a mixed bag, because in some ways you could see where it led to better days ahead for WWE, but at the same time, when it comes to the basic premise of professional wrestling and that era of legitimacy, it did a lot to set that back, at a time when it was bad enough making people believe that these people wanted to fight each other and beat each other, especially in WWE's cartoonish format. And we will talk about WWE's cartoonish format another day, because I want to break that down, and that will be another episode. But so the Curtain Call's legacy is obviously a mixed bag. I think that's the best way to put it, because some of it is obviously beneficial, some of it was long-term detrimental, but at the end of the day, everybody was affected by it. Not just the Clique, not just Vince McMahon, everybody. And it was one of those things that started sparking those Monday Night Wars. But speaking of televised war programming, I want to talk about the Wednesday Night Wars. Okay? I want to make something very clear to everybody at home. The Wednesday Night Wars are a joke. Now, let me explain. Back when wrestling was relevant, which it is not right now. Say what you want, but it's not. When wrestling was relevant, as in the Monday Night Wars, the ratings and the draw power and the responses on Facebook, which wasn't existent at the time, their ratings and the way that they drew money was so astronomically powerful and had so many fans gearing up and riling up to go and see them, to the point it was 4 million apiece. There were 8 to 12 million people watching pro wrestling every single week. How much, and that was what true competition, when it was really fighting for the ratings. They were on at the same time. They worked hard to be better than the other company and really show that they were the best show around, and that forced WWE to kind of turn into a more legitimate state. But then, of course, you've got Russo booking and all the wackadoodle Jerry Springer stuff. But the people who were on the top were good at the top because they still felt legitimate. WCW was really the same way, in that they had the legitimate looking guys, and they were able to cut the promos and get people to watch, and it was the cool thing to do. Modern pro wrestling does not have those types of people because they have bred them out thanks to WWE being around for so long and being the only game in town for so long. And I've said this about AEW. I don't know how much I've said it here, but I've said this about AEW before, that AEW promised sports-based presentation, and what we got was sports entertainment presentation, only just kind of at a discounted rate. And this whole the stadium stampede thing, and even people like Jericho getting in on it, and some of the ridiculous stuff that they've put on that broadcast. I love Matt Hardy, but I really truly believe that he should have dropped to the broken gimmick. He should have gone to something different, reinvent himself. He's done it so many times. He should have been able to do it here instead of going back to a trope that was popular 4 years ago in TNA and at the very beginning in WWE, but it just wasn't going to fly again. The point I'm making here is that we've got two companies, WWE, which has got its developmental program, going up against AEW, which is TNT's program, which even at TNT's lowest, and back in 2001 when WCW was folding, they were getting maybe these ratings, right? They were getting the ratings that they're getting now. AEW, when they started, had got 1.3 million viewers. They have not broken a million since. I think they may have gotten 1.1 in week 2, I think. And then since then, it's been 900,000, then 800,000, then 700,000, and it's kind of stilted at 700,000 to, I think the last one was like 660 or something like that. And NXT is doing no better. They're getting pretty much the same kind of viewers. They're getting 800,000, 700,000, 600,000, kind of in that cycle, which is saying to me that there's nobody wanting to tune into these shows to see what wrestling's all about. What you're getting is the same people who have always been wrestling fans, all the smarks who have always watched these shows and are looking for an alternative to the main roster show. You got the same group of people watching each show every week and then claiming that wrestling is in a boom. Well, I hate to break it to you people, but the whole point of wrestling back in the day was not only to entertain people, but, to draw people in and to draw more money. And here we are, and I guess neither side cares about drawing fans. I know AEW is patting themselves on the back for getting 660,000 viewers, which is absurd to me, because how is a network like TNT going to look at those numbers and go, you guys are doing a great job? Why don't you stick and get less than... It must be siphoning money out of Tony Khan's father's pocket. It's gotta be. It's gotta be costing the network money. They need to be getting people to actually watch this show. And the same with NXT. I mean, obviously, WWE is such a massive powerhouse in financially that they don't have to worry, and they clearly do not care about the ratings at all, because look at Raw. Raw has been increasing. I think their lowest is like 1.6 million now was their rating, I think, last week. So clearly they don't even care about their main shows drawing anymore, because they're just making money from the network, so they don't give a toss. And but AEW does have a lot more at stake, but they're all catering to the fans that they already had, which is not in any way a feasible way to draw money, which is the whole point of pro wrestling to begin with. And I think AEW really wants, I could see they're wanting to get more legitimate talent involved, because they got FTR and they got Brian Cage and they have Taz and Jake Roberts and Cody and Lance Archer, who are all great talent. But they don't know how to use or book or understand how to bring the best out of these people enough to where people believe in them enough, not believe in the wrestling, not believe in AEW, but believe in the people enough to want to continue to watch them perform and to watch them wrestle. And WWE and NXT, you know, it's doing a good job too. I mean, obviously this crisis is hurting a lot of things, and I'm not even attributing it to that. But crisis or no crisis, either way, they've been stagnant in viewership, which tells me that they're not drawing any fans. They're not luring people who would not normally watch wrestling in to watch wrestling. They're luring the same people who already watch wrestling and do podcasts like this to watch wrestling. So there's no war going on when you've got the same people watching the same shows week in and week out, and there's no, they beat these guys in the ratings. We're talking a couple 100,000 people, not a million people switched. Or hell, when it was leaked on Nitro that Mick Foley was going to win the world title, the amount of viewership from AEW right now turned the channel to watch Mick Foley win the world title. How can you feel good about the fact that your draw number now is the same amount of people who switched shows during the true peak of professional wrestling's drawing power on a national scale? This is obviously not talking about the territories when it was wrestling was much bigger as a whole, and there were more companies and more people made more money, and you know, and I'm not trying to just say that we need to go back to the territories. That's not the point. The point I'm trying to make here is it's absolutely ridiculous for these people, especially these ones who have these YouTube channels, who are going, this is such a good time and it's exciting time for wrestling. It is an abysmal time for wrestling, because now we're getting cinematic matches, which isn't pro wrestling. It's not pro wrestling at all. It's entertainment. It's low cut, low budget, insulting entertainment to anyone who ever wanted to believe or have their suspension of disbelief lifted while they're watching a show. But instead, both sides are slapping people in the face. WWE is just, because they're milking format where they're just milking everything for time. It's just, everything's so slow and disinteresting. And I like a lot of the guys on that show too. It's not a knock on any of them. And AEW, who's just, half of them don't even know what they're doing. And what's worse is that the executive vice presidents, save for Cody, have no clue how to book. They have no clue what a heel and a babyface are, at least that I can tell, because they're booking stuff that makes no sense and has no continuity, and except if you're in the little close group of friends. You know, it's funny. They like to demonize the Clique for running roughshod over 94, 95, 96. How is it any different with AEW right now? If you're a friend of the EVPs, you got a job. If you're an EVP, that's where the most in-depth storyline is coming from. Cody's got the best storylines. The Young Bucks, whether they deserve it or not, have interesting storylines. Hangman Page, Kenny Omega, they're all in this little hoo-ha of people who are getting the top tier deals. And that's exactly, and so they're obviously just playing their own little dog and pony show just to amuse themselves, and they jack themselves off, and then the people who are watching the show, who always watch the show and were following these guys, continue to jack themselves off, and jack them off, and then they could, it's one big AEW circle jerk over there. And WWE is so phoned in on their side that despite Triple H's efforts, it's just not coming together. And a big part of that is that wrestling's corpse has been completely sodomized. And you could blame the curtain call in some respects for why this phenomenon is happening. But to say that this is a Wednesday night war and that these people are fighting for supremacy, nobody's gaining or losing fans. Not on a scale that is actually sizable or mentionable. My belief is that no matter what happens with WWE, unless there's a massive talent walkout, or B, all the shareholders leave at the same time, or what is already kind of in the midst of happening, which is a massive class action lawsuit from the XFL, which is just going to increase as more cases of our current crisis abound within the company, they're not going to care. So they don't need to care about their ratings. AEW needs to care about their ratings, but they think that what they're getting is good, and when TNT pulls the plug, they're going to be pissed out of water, and they're going to be peeing into their own rain troughs just to get some sort of beverages for themselves. And it's annoying to me, the concept that people actually think that wrestling is booming right now, when it is arguably at its all-time lowest. And I'm not so sure that wrestling is going to survive. Or sports entertainment. I'm sorry, I shouldn't even be calling it wrestling. Sports entertainment is not a survivable model, and I don't think it's going to survive. In 5 years' time, we're either going to have no wrestling whatsoever, no new programming at all, or we're going to have WWE still trudging on to about the amount of fans that NXT's getting, but their money's going to be all made on being the Netflix of pro wrestling, which, by the way, you're going to be able to find AEW shows on. And we're all just going to have to accept the fact that what pro wrestling turned into, because of the sports entertainment move, and because a whole generation of talent doesn't know the difference or never was taught the difference or don't care enough to know the difference, we're going to get basically what's left of pro wrestling circling the drain now, just flushed completely down the toilet, into the sewer, and out into the ocean with the rest of the garbage mountain that is stacking up in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and they're going to have nobody to blame but themselves. And that's a damn shame, because there's some great talent out there who I know would take it seriously, want to take it seriously, but because of the rest of the show and the way that the show is formatted on both sides, will never get that opportunity, and they're never going to be able to bring back the magic that was prior to this era of wrestling, which really began when WWE became the only game in town. And that's really the bottom line of it. When WCW died, that was the end, in my view. And WWE had some great years from 2002, I would say, all the way up until 2010. And it's been sporadic ever since, a good match here, a good match there, a good show here, a good show there. But for the most part, we are now at a point where wrestling is never going to recapture the magic unless there is a group of people who want to take it seriously, do take it seriously, and say, we are going to bring a rebirth to pro wrestling. And unfortunately, I thought NWA was going to be like that, but then they got Spineless Lagana, and let's see what happened to him. And they just had management issues, and I really thought that was going to be the place. And maybe it still will be. But there needs to be more of that and less of sports entertainment if we want any semblance of wrestling to survive in the next 5 years, because this is a crucial point for the entire industry. It's sink or swim time, folks, and that's the bottom line. And I hope that we will be able to determine what we want wrestling to look like going forward, because as it stands right now, it's just going to go further and further down unless something major changes. And I'm not just talking about Vince McMahon. I'm talking about in the industry as a whole. American wrestling is either going to fight for their actual beliefs, they're going to fight to return to wrestling, or they're going to die in a sea of entertainment that nobody wanted in the first place. So, now that I've got that out of the way, we are now on to the second half of the show. And wait a minute. We're at the second half of the show, and you know what that means.
What time is it?
It's the fight, it's the brawl, it's the match of the week. It's tonight, watch along with the son of a beat. It's one fall, the down for the 1, 2, and 3. So don't stall, hang on to the edge of your seat. We got a punch and a flip and a powerbomb too. All the moves and the stars are all under review. See the babyface cheered and the heels get heat. This is wrestling at its peak. It's the match of the week. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, we have finally finished our match of the week intro. We have finally gotten it to you. I told you it was coming. There it is, there it was, and now every time we have a match of the week, boom shakalaka, that's what you're going to see. Now, today's match of the week is a fun one. It is because we had Backlash a couple weeks ago, and I know I've been trying to avoid talking about Backlash, even though it's left my mouth pretty much every show since. The one match on that show that I thought was halfway passable until the Lana finish was Drew McIntyre versus Bobby Lashley. Well, it's not the first time these two have faced each other. And so I went on to the YouTubes, and I found myself a match, Drew Galloway versus Bobby Lashley on the June 14th episode of Impact Wrestling from 2016. Now, the night before, or 2 nights before, Bobby Lashley had injured Drew McIntyre's ribs and won the Impact Heavyweight Championship at Slammiversary. So this was the return bout. McIntyre, I'm calling him McIntyre. I know his name's Galloway in this one, in Impact, but forgive me if I cross-pollinate names. But Galloway had taped up ribs when he came in. All the entrance themes came in. The entrance themes actually sounded somewhat legitimate. The crowd was into Drew Galloway, which I have not watched a whole lot of Impact at all for a very long time. Mainly because of Josh Matthews. I cannot stand him on commentary. But he was actually one of the least offenders on the commentary team this go-round. Drew Galloway comes in, Bobby Lashley comes in. You can't hear the commentary because the themes were super loud, so whoever was mixing the sound clearly just was not getting the levels right. And then we start this match. Drew immediately goes for a Claymore, but Lashley just starts beating him down. Then Lashley just hitting the ribs and hitting the ribs and hitting the ribs. EC3 is on commentary because EC3 challenged Bobby Lashley for the Impact Heavyweight Championship, but Drew got his rematch first. EC3 on commentary, and EC3 sounded like John Laurinaitis at the Masters on this whole thing. De Niro, the Pope D'Angelo De Niro, actually sounded excited. He was adding a lot as a color guy. Matthews didn't sound nearly as ham-hocked as he normally does, and that was my big problem with Matthews. He goes, oh, and then he goes over here and he does the big goal, but I'm slam, and I'm Josh Matthews, and I'm doing wrestling commentary, and it just sounds awful. It just is awful. And but D'Angelo De Niro was doing great. Matthews was really kind of a little bit toned down this time, and EC3 was like way toned down. It was like 3 complete different levels of commentary here. But then Drew gets the advantage and then German suplexes Bobby Lashley onto the ring ropes, onto the 6-sided ring, which is super tight ropes, it had to have looked, that was painful. Then they go on, they brawl on for the outside. There's a lot of knife edge chops, a lot of clubs, a lot of fights. This felt like a fight. It felt like these two were trying to beat each other for the richest prize in the company. This is the type of wrestling that I like. It was hard, it was gritty, it wasn't clean. You know, not everything was crisp. Both Drew McIntyre and Bobby Lashley, something that NXT doesn't do, but Drew Lashley and Bobby McIntyre both broke up counts when the referee was counting to 5 and 6. Then Bobby Lashley hit Galloway with a side slam on the apron that just looked brutal. And they kept going. They worked the ribs really hard. They did a picture-in-picture, but it was fine because Bobby Lashley was getting into the ring, so there was nothing happening on the left side picture, which was live action, so you could see the replay without having to miss action, which is one of my biggest frustrations when they do the picture-in-pictures in WWE. The camera work here was great. The heel work from Bobby Lashley was really good. He was flexing, he was showboating, he was being a dick. And the crowd started cheering for Galloway. It put Drew, made him feel more like a babyface. You could immediately tell who is heel, who is babyface by the way they were working. This is some of the best I've seen of Lashley as far as his arrogant cockiness. I'm an MMA fighter. I'm also a pro wrestler, and I'm your world champion, and I'm great, and there's nothing you can do about it. And he's got those pearly whites, that shit-eating grin on him that just made you despise him, but you couldn't slap him because he's Bobby freaking Lashley. And this was a 14-minute match. It wasn't milked for time. You weren't seeing people walking around and talking, you see that a lot in WWE where it's just all milked and they're just standing around. And then there's a couple spots and then it's more standing around. This wasn't over milked for time. They took the pauses when they needed to, but it wasn't so bad that you didn't have just where there's these lull moments, which is, everyone points to Randy Orton for having these types of matches, but it really isn't Orton's fault that WWE's format's like that, where everything's just super over milked for time. This was great. Then Drew ducks Bobby Lashley, hits him with a neck breaker that was not Triple H versus Kane bad. It still looked kind of good, but it was still a little disjointed, but enough to where you could see it was more of a grit comeback, like a desperation move, so it didn't look staged. It looked like it would happen in the heat of the moment, which makes a huge difference. And then there's a couple counters, and Drew hits a spike pile driver that looked absolutely debilitating and gets a 2 count. There's just some serious grit between these two. This match was light years better than their match at Backlash. Even though the match at Backlash was good, I liked what they did there, but it wasn't under WWE's let's just stall and walk around and smile a lot, especially because there were no fans in that one, and there were plenty of fans here. De Niro was so into this. He was so hyped up, and he was amped, and you could tell he was adding energy to the match, and you felt that gravitas, and that was so necessary. Meanwhile, EC3's going, they're both really nice competitors, and I don't know doesn't matter who they're going to face, they both had intensity, and I'm EC3. And I'm like, where is EC3's excitement? I was kind of expecting him to be more of a loudmouth, like he usually is, but he just was like, he was way too clean. Then Galloway hits a Celtic cross from the second rope, which looked fantastic. Galloway tries to hit the Claymore not once but twice, but he connects on the third time and nearly decapitates the referee. Then Bobby Lashley goes to get a steel chair after he hits Lashley with hits Galloway rather with 2 spears, and goes to get a steel chair because the referee's obviously down. EC3 takes the chair saying, no, you're going to win this fairly. They go to fight. EC3 gets the better of Lashley, goes to hit the chair. Lashley goes to pick up Galloway, and of course EC3 swings, Bobby ducks, and Galloway gets hit in the ribs again, but this time by EC3 inadvertently with a steel chair. Then a spear to EC3, and then Lashley goes for a cover. Another referee comes in, then he hits a triangle, which is what Bobby Lashley was using, was a big old hefty triangle hold. And Galloway was obviously so hurt and so beat up that he passed out in the finish. So it was by TKO, Bobby Lashley retains the heavyweight championship. And for a TV match, this was pretty damn good. Everything in this was great. They obviously added EC3 into the mix, so he was probably going to end up feuding with Galloway. But Lashley was still put in. There were layers to this. It was a well-paced match. They worked really well together. Very clear heel, very clear babyface. The crowd was into it. This was great. It's maybe one of the best Impact matches I've seen of the modern Impact arena, which was, from basically 2013, I say from Aces and Eights roughly on. This was one of the best matches that I've seen. These guys put in work. It was effective. It made sense. They looked great. Everything about this was wonderful. And I give full marks to everyone involved in this. Even EC3, I just wish that his commentary was a little better. That was really my only knock on this whole thing, was just EC3's very quiet and calm and collected commentary. when he had a vested interest in who was going to win the match. So it was, but all in all, I totally 100% recommend you watching this match because it was great. And I'm very happy with how this went. And it was a great one. And we may have to take a peek into Impact matches more often, depending on what we did. But that's our match of the week for this week, which leads us into our Superstar Spotlight. And I have chosen this week Bobby Lashley. The Almighty, the Destroyer, doesn't matter. Now, there are several acquaintances of mine, and I will not call them anything higher on the status poll than acquaintances, who are really, really big into Bobby Lashley. Almost nauseatingly, in fact. But I don't blame them for getting behind the guy, because I think Bobby was put in a spot where he was not going to succeed based on how he was presented, which you could say for any number of guys. Bobby, when he came in 2004, I think 2004, 2005, for the WWE, obviously, big guy, big muscles, but greener than grass. Started to develop it, was getting there, he was doing better, and then they put him in ECW, which was, this was a very distinctive WWE guy. And they were going to groom him and cultivate him to be the WWE guy. Being in the ECW sphere just didn't fit, which is why they took the belt off Lashley and gave it to, of all people, Vince McMahon. Which was, again, just a nice little slap in the face to anyone who cared about ECW prior to them being enveloped by Vince McMahon and co. And then Lashley kind of drifted off along. He had a good program with Umaga, which I liked. Which the program itself, if it didn't involve Vince McMahon and Donnie T, probably would have been. Would be looked at in better regard because Umaga was great, and we'll have to do a spotlight on him in the near future. But Lashley, he was getting it, but he wasn't getting the blend. The personality wasn't there. And some argue the personality still isn't there, but I would disagree with that. Based on what I saw in this match with Lashley and McIntyre, a.k.a. Galloway, I think that he has a lot of personality. He just needed to be in an environment where that could be cultivated. And it really didn't get cultivated until he ended up kind of joining along with MVP. And I think that he and MVP are really a perfect combination for each other. It started with the Beatdown Clan to BDC in TNA, which had its moments. I wasn't in on all of it, but MVP is a hell of a talker. He was able to give Bobby a little bit more flair to him that allowed him, even once he added the air of legitimacy to him. I think he's like 22-2 or something like that in MMA. I mean, he's got a terrific record in MMA. Does Bobby Lashley. And teaming him up with MVP and kind of getting him that guidance and working him, he really came into his own, which is how we ended up with a great match like we saw in our match of the week. And, there's no cap to what Bobby Lashley could do, and it's why he became a world champion there. And then he goes back to WWE and they suck all the life out of him again. And then they team him up with Leo Rush, and Leo Rush is a good talker, so he started getting back into it, and then they gave him those god-awful yellow contacts for no reason, and then they made him look like an idiot again, because that's all. WWE only knows how to make people look like idiots. They don't know how to make people look good, period. They do not know how to make people look good. And Bobby Lashley is probably the biggest sign of that, because then everyone was like, oh yeah, I forgot, he was a charisma vacuum and he couldn't do anything. But now look at him. Now he's there with MVP again. And it baffles me that they didn't go for another match in this program with Lashley and Drew, because they obviously have a hell of a chemistry together. But MVP and Drew, MVP and Bobby, they had the chemistry. And it kind of reinvigorated my interest in Bobby Lashley. And I think that he has really gotten the raw end of the public perception. I think he's been much better than many people have given him credit for, but it only comes in waves because you only got to see it when he was around the right people and working with the right people. But, you know, the Lashley's TNA run, there's a reason they brought him back. It wasn't because, you just, oh, we need musclehead guys, even though that Vince loves doing that, but it was because Lashley had earned it. He'd earned, it wasn't even just about the promos. Not to saying he couldn't cut them because he was doing all right with them. But Bobby, I've always felt was an underrated talent. Got the raw end of quite a few deals, was put into programs that he didn't fit in, that didn't make any sense, and then they gave Lana to him, and that didn't make any sense. And it's just, they did everything in their power to ruin this man. And this man has persevered no matter what he's done. He's a hell of an athlete. He's a hell of a worker. And he deserves respect, and I don't think that he gets anywhere near the level that he should for everything that he's accomplished in this business and out. And I hope that eventually Lashley gets to a place where he can really demonstrate that, or he's acknowledged by the people on top of those businesses that Lashley really is a talent that deserves to be the world champion and what he's really able and capable of doing. And with that said, it is time to go to our first commercial break. And now, next week, I'm going to tease, but I'm not going to promise, that we may have a brand new guest on the show. And if not, it'll just be me, and we'll keep doing what we do. And until then, thank you very much for listening. We will see you next time, next week. We will be right back after these short messages.